IndiCast 12, part 2, and action.
Hi Jay.
Hi, Raj.
So I think today on an extremely hot day in Delhi NCR, you can judge by our outfits.
It's so hot.
We are here to discuss a very heated up topic also, and or rather, a topic which has a lot of potential to heat up. Last time we left off India's foreign policy somewhere in the late 2000s,
Mhm.
and we will pick it up from India's foreign policy over the last 10 years. Experts and observers might agree that the last decade has had maybe some sort of a pivot in India's foreign policy where we may have taken actions which can be viewed slightly more assertive
Yes.
than our past trajectory in foreign policy terms. 2000s, the early 2000s for India saw many repetitive terror attacks, and
Yes.
there was a frustration in the collective psyche of the country about the inaction of the government with regard to that. And post 2014, I think there's been somewhat of a radical shift on that note, at least. Even on many other areas, India may have been playing a more sort of dominant or assertive role. India tries to sometimes successfully uh, exert an image of a leader of the global south. That was how we sold the G20 summit that was held last year. And even more so, India tries to emerge as a major regional power in this part of the world.
Yes.
And I think the West is engaging with this new idea of India because of the challenges they have with respect to China. That is
Yes.
my overall summation of the last 10 years, an introduction to what we are going to talk about. What are your thoughts, Jay?
So, in the last 10 years, we saw a radical change in our approach with respect to international relations because before that, we were still pretty much non aligned to a very large extent, and that too towards Soviet Union and like then the breakaway Russian states, specifically during the 90s. So, coming back to the last 10 years, I feel that the tilt of Indian foreign policy has been towards America. It has been towards creating a power regionally which can also stand up to China. Because before that, India was still reeling from the disastrous Himalayan War of 1962. And what has happened in the last 10 years is that India has tried to make itself extremely relevant in those conventions or conferences where it can be viewed as a natural opponent to the rising influence of China, be it trying to better its relations with the ASEAN countries through Look East policy, or trying to get a dominant role in managing all of Indian Ocean, which obviously connects through the Atlantic and Pacific, by assisting the Five Eyes, which is essentially the Anglosphere, which includes countries like New Zealand, Canada,
Australia and the US.
yes. And after that, the most important change in India's foreign policy, specifically with respect to global politics, was during the Galwan crisis in 2020, because then India got the confidence to finally get the major powers in the world on a video conference through the quadrilateral conference, which happened through video calls.
The Quad was conceptualized all the way back in
2007,
2007.
Shinzo Abe.
Yes, and I think it didn't catch as much steam
Yes.
earlier, but we saw radical improvement in the speed with respect to this four country member forum of nations when almost all these nations started having their own tussles with China with respect to trade. We've
Yes.
had the US China trade relations sour all the way back since 2016. We have had um, um, a not so major incident with China in 2017, and then a very major incident in 2020, which has in some ways continued, whether it's the issue of illegal settlements in the Ladakh area or even Arunachal Pradesh. So India's got its own issues with China. The US has its own trade related issues with China. And almost all four members of the Quad, including Japan and Australia, have have not looked eye to eye with
with China.
China,
Yes.
and that's a very critical component of why the trade talks, these talks took up.
Absolutely, and that we can say all see in, like, different economic trajectories. India now is trying to compete with China in the manufacturing sector, specifically trying to match the smartphone building capacity and technology that China has, and also trying to enter the market of making semiconductors and those microchips. What are those called?
Yeah, semiconductors. Well,
Semiconductors. Yes,
I think
microchips.
that
Yeah.
that's another
Yeah.
topic in itself. And on the contrary, as a very nationalist person myself, or I do think that I think India has missed the boat when it comes
Okay.
to acquiring a critical part of the semiconductor
Yes.
supply chain industry. I think I read a very interesting book and I heard a podcast on that book. It's called The Chips Are Down.
Hmm.
One of its co authors was on a podcast by The Hindu. Pranay Kothastane was his name.
Mhm.
And he explained how, very interestingly, both India and Taiwan had received semiconductor technologies with some kind of technology transfer from the US together in the late 80s or the
Mhm.
90s, at some point like that. I'm not sure about the timeline, but Taiwan was much more experimental with its industrialization and its the privatization of the semiconductor industry of sorts. And India acquired a much more government to government approach, that the manufacturing and sale of like semiconductors would be restricted to government industry, which was a reflection of the times that
Yes,
India was
socialist
living
policy.
in that,
Yeah.
exactly. And as a result, I think we lost out on the critical component. You can't compete with somebody who has a 30-year advantage with you there. But I think we can capture another essential element of the supply chain in the same industry. We shouldn't concentrate on manufacturing semiconductors, but you can just capturing a part of a supply chain would be a realistic victory there. I think we diverted from the main topic over there a little bit, but we'll reason around back to
Yes.
India China relations. So,
Yeah, so towards India, so towards China, India has an extremely dual approach. One is of hostility and hostility and suspicion, and the other one is of trade collaboration and partnership, because India is still in debt with respect to China, and also China is the biggest smartphone provider in India as of now, with its companies selling the most amounts of Android based smartphones in India. So, with respect to that, it is a very synchronous relationship with China, where it has its lowest lows and highest highs at the same
yeah,
time.
I think one of the major disadvantages we have against China are that India has lost out on a lot of critical information, perhaps because we are not sure about the nature of the Chinese devices and how much surveillancing can be done through them. Yet they are extremely well manufacturing technically advanced cell phones, which are affordable to
Masses.
the average Indian consumer. So I think that's a major success for a lot of Chinese cell phone manufacturers.
And I think that is another reason why the conflict between India and China hasn't escalated to the levels it could have.
Yeah, precisely. And I think that a certain amount of trade relations should be encouraged. It's even positive actually. But India and China, the relationship sours when India engages with the opacity with China. There is a historical trauma that we have with that country. You try to engage diplomatically, and then suddenly a major loophole is exploited by them, maybe on our borders, maybe in our foreign policy system.
Yes,
So I think that there is the entire foreign policy and security establishment of India will have a hard time trusting China, even if you start hearing the right voices from over
obviously.
there. India has tried its many initiatives to counter the regional influence of China, whether it be the Sagar initiative, which is the security and growth for all in the region.
Yes.
That's the full form, which is basically India's outreach to its small island
Mhm.
nations, which have in many cases received a lot of infrastructure funding from China,
Mhm.
and China has not really expected a repayment of the loans it extends, rather it captures strategic advantages in those island nations.
Yes.
And to have to counter that influence from the Indian foreign policy establishment is not a very easy task.
Yes.
I would credit the Indian Ministry of External Affairs for trying. It's
Yeah.
going to be a challenging feat.
Absolutely. So, with respect to China and its foreign installations, specifically with respect to countries which are not being able to pay back the loans that China has extended to them, we have countries like Montenegro in the Balkans, whose entire critical social infrastructure, right from the main highways to the roads, are being constructed by the Chinese. And inadvertently, what we are seeing right now is like a very, very nascent stage of worldwide colonialism that the Chinese Communist Party is intent on, and that is the extremely cautious view that I have of the Chinese establishment. Correct me if I'm wrong, Raj.
No, I absolutely agree with you. I think that there is a clear, blatant advantage that China has exploited because of its own far-sightedness. We gotta give the devil
Mhm.
its due. They were smart about their manufacturing industries. Their
Mhm.
great leap forward gave them an economic advantage to which we are still trying to catch up.
Mhm.
And I hope we do. I hope we are able to compete soon enough. And in addition to that, what bothers anybody who is cautious about China lately is that you have the Western led international order kind of fighting for its own relevance right now. You have two major wars going on, one in Eastern Europe, one in Western Asia. Uh, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the United States, their allies, have largely failed to aid efforts to secede violence in those nations. And this over time weakens countries in those regions because a lot of economic aid is also going to either finance or to curtail violence in those regions.
Mhm.
And who is the winner in these conflicts? Who is a neutral party who's observing very quietly? It's probably China. I was listening
So,
to a talk by the president
yeah.
of ORF, who basically indicated the point that gave me this idea.
Yeah,
Uh,
so to add to what you've said, specifically with respect to India's perspective, I think in the last 10 years, we've also seen certain levels of ambiguity with respect to certain polarizing issues. Specifically, if you see the war that's happening in Ukraine, there also we were able to give a neutral perspective where we said that there should be a ceasefire and we did not outwardly go against the Russian interests. Then take the example of the present Middle Eastern crisis that's happening in the Gaza Strip, where the Israeli forces recently made a push towards the Rafah border crossing, which is close to the Egypt border, where the Americans also stopped certain amounts of weapons that they were sending the
mhm.
Israeli establishment because they said that that would be a violation of the international humanitarian law.
Yeah.
So, keeping all of that in mind, India again has been able to keep a very neutral stance where they have been successfully they have not only successfully buttered the Arab voices, they have successfully buttered the Israelis also, and now they're building a port at Gwadar with Iran.
Chabahar.
Chabahar, my bad, I'm so sorry.
Gwadar is Pakistan.
Sorry, Gwadar is Pakistan. Chabahar, I'm so sorry. And from Chabahar you have the whole discussion with respect to how a highway would connect it to the Caspian border of Iran,
The
and through,
India Middle Eastern
yeah,
Economic Corridor,
and
you
through the
mean?
Caspian border it'll go to
Yeah.
Russia.
I think the
Yeah.
India Middle
Chabahar.
Eastern Economic Corridor was conceptualized
Yeah.
at the G20 summit, which was held in Delhi. But by the way, I think the New Delhi Declaration in itself
Yeah.
was a huge success because the world has been divided
Yep.
fairly strongly at the moment. To get a lot of countries to cooperate and sign a declaration in itself is a major feat. However, I think it's not been all rosy for our foreign policy lately because I think the late 2023 part has to be met with two instances. One major instance of Indian intelligence personnel, very unfortunately, being caught
Mm-hmm.
in
Qatar.
alleged Indian
Mm-hmm.
intelligence personnel being caught in
Qatar.
uh, various countries, actually many countries, even in the Five Eyes
Canada,
Alliance.
Canada, US.
Yes, alleging that India has been interfering in their countries and trying to assassinate their agents. My guess is as good as any viewers on the
Yeah.
authenticity of these claims.
Hmm.
India strongly worded its statement, especially against the China. The response to the US allegation and the Chinese Canadian, my bad. The response to the US allegation and the Canadian allegation were very interestingly, very differently worded. The Canadian allegation was brushed off. The Canadians were told that they are enabling a safe space to harbor extremist organizations. If you didn't read the term Canada, it would almost look like it's a statement that's been drafted for Pakistan.
Yeah.
And with the US, India was very cooperative, and I think it's understandable because the US is sort of the leader of the Western bloc, and we have to maintain somewhat decent relations with them. And so I think this divergence
Yeah.
is understandable. India and the US, despite its issues in trade relations, which we have seen, there's something about tariffs on walnuts, and some American industries complaining about a tough regulatory environment in India. Other than those issues, the security cooperation between US and India has been by and large very good. And I think even this assassination attempt incident, the US will be able to forgive because of its strategic requirement to cooperate with India
Yes.
for China.
Again, it brings us back to the assertive policy that the Modi government has taken. And if the alleged allegations against the Indian state for funding these international espionage operations slash assassinations, I feel they have been largely successful. I mean, you look at the multiple attacks that have taken place now in the Gwadar port, near the Gwadar port, specifically against Chinese interests, so that the Chinese investment and other types of stability that the place guarantees is disrupted as much as it can be. What
Well,
is your take on
you
that?
can't say that Indian agents were behind it.
Of course you can't. Of course
So
you said.
I
I
mean, you
said
can't
that's why I said alleged.
you can't claim.
Yeah, that's why I said alleged. I did
Yeah,
not say that the Indian agents are responsible for that. I said allegedly.
yeah.
If they are allegedly involved in it,
Then it's a success. I
then it's a
mean,
success.
that brings you to the
Yeah.
old opinion that if it's a good success in intelligence agencies,
Hmm.
then you will not hear of it. I
Of
mean,
course.
maybe India has been able to successfully neutralize some of its adversaries,
Yeah.
but we will not hear that on the news,
Obviously.
as we shouldn't.
We shouldn't.
And
It shouldn't be like, so blatant. And I think that's why the Canadians got really angry, because
yeah,
they were like, "Yeah, how dare they? Like this third world country, which was literally, one of the sources of colonialism for the white people, how are they conducting such attacks at our place?"
yeah.
I'm joking.
Anyway,
I'm joking.
coming back. So I was mentioning two foreign policy
Yeah.
failures, rather
Yeah.
challenges. These intelligence agencies not being able to meet their task in these issues was one. The other one is uh, the announcement of IMEC almost came at the worst time it could have. The India Middle East Economic
Yes.
Corridor is announced in September 2023. In October, you have those Hamas fighters entering Israel on October 7th. And the entire peace and stability, or the attempt to attain peace and stability in West Asia,
Is gone.
goes for a toss.
Yeah.
So it's almost like the IMEC is dead on arrival.
Yeah.
The concept of IMEC is right, that you have trade goods that take the sea route.
It was a deal which was done by UAE, India, Saudi Arabia, and Israel.
Right,
So
right.
it was through that India would get access to the Mediterranean Sea.
My larger point is that overall the region got destabilized.
Yes,
You have
absolutely.
the Houthi rebels in
Mhm.
that region attacking sea vessels and commercial vessels which are moving through the Suez Canal. Then you have commercial vessels taking the route through the Cape of Good Hope, which is
Okay.
increasing production costs, manufacturing costs. As a result, global prices are rising. So the idea of an economic corridor not only has it been pushed back a few years, I think it can only seem like a distant dream right now.
Yes, of
Because
course.
before establishing an economic corridor, you need some regional stability in that area.
Yes. And like
So,
specifically after the open support that Hamas got from the Iranian state, Iran is again pushing forward towards the domination of the Islamic world. So the Sunni powers in the Middle East would not be okay with that as well. So what would happen is that the Sunni powers would also try to show their dominance in the region. And right now, from what I can understand, is that they cannot bank on the so-called idea of Islamic unity amongst different states. For them, the biggest thing that can actually counter Iran is Israel. So what the Sunni groups are trying to do is that they're trying to pacify Iran's threat to their regional domination through Israel, which has got the Western support. So that's how they try to bring down Iran as of now. So, and that's what I feel India is taking a very, very interesting stance on this, because right now India's gone on to declare 1 day's mourning after the unfortunate passing of the president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Mr. Raisi, who died in a tragic helicopter crash, and the Indian state declared 1 day of mourning for that. So I think India's push towards appeasing the Shias, and this is, if the perceived villain is the general Islamic world, that's how India is trying to divide the two sides.
I think a few hours ago, the foreign minister also went to the Iranian diplomatic mission in New Delhi,
Yeah,
and paid official condolences and signed a official note
yeah,
to the government of Iran. And I think that this is a very limited way of viewing
of course,
foreign policy.
of
I think
course,
because if you put a communal touch to it,
of course, of course.
India's mostly been working hard to improve relations with the Gulf.
Yeah, yeah,
We all know the dominant religion in the Gulf.
yeah, yeah.
So
But again, I was talking from a perspective of, say, the push where this particular world is considered as like the main antagonist.
right.
So from that angle, of course, it's a very, very restrictive angle, and I don't particularly agree with it. But
Yeah.
this could be one of the other moves also, if you're looking into the communal nature, which sometimes does influence foreign policy. What's your take on that?
No, I agree with you. It definitely impacts foreign policy greatly. As an observer, I wouldn't say
Yes,
so.
exactly.
And I think it will continue to do so in the next few years.
Absolutely.
To summarize, I think the last few years have definitely marked a pivot in India's foreign policy. It's definitely a lot less passive country. It's definitely a country which has started making noise in the world of espionage and international security. It's definitely a country which wants to twitch the regional balance in our favor in the South Asian region. It wants to openly challenge China. It wants to openly dictate its ties even with the Western world,
Yes.
and how we want to engage our security cooperation with them. I think this is overall a refreshing image for people who, in the early 2000s or the late 90s, grew up in a very sort of passive
Pacifist type of
environment.
environment where dialogue was given more emphasis. Right now, the approach is more heavy-handed.
Yeah, I think dialogue is still the primary driver of international relations. It is still what is given emphasis. But I think what the dialogue contains is also important.
Absolutely.
I think there is a nature of an assertion of a kind of threat that India also sort of provides now. I also feel like sometimes it's not totally a bad thing that your agents are being caught
Yeah.
in other countries. I always suspected that Saudi Arabia,
Yeah.
sometimes I suspect that they intentionally got caught with the Khashoggi killings
Yeah.
in Turkey. They happened
Yeah,
in
Turkey. That was just to send
Yeah,
out a message
yeah.
to
So
the
that
detractors of MBS.
your critics know
Yeah,
who they are messing with.
absolutely.
And that's I think that would be my take on the last 10 years of Indian foreign policy and the state of
Yes.
affairs of the world. Jay, do you have anything more to add on
So,
that?
I think just to conclude, our foreign policy goals essentially are pretty much the same from the last 20 years, where we try to assert our control over JNK and try to tell the world that it is an integral part of our country. So towards that, we work really hard. That's why we get foreign diplomats to come visit JNK, specifically who had a positive opinion about India's claims over Kashmir. So, with respect to that, that's one of our foreign policy goals. The other one is obviously to make us look like the next contender in the unipolar world, like specifically at the top. So, like, if there is the United States of America, if there is China, if there is Russia, then you have to think
Yeah.
about India as well. And there has to be an economic angle to it as well, where economic prosperity is being witnessed, technological access is being provided to the masses, and the social infrastructure improves, specifically with respect to healthcare and the overall HDI increases, so that the perception of the Indian state is not that of a weak economic state which is dependent on other countries, but also a self-sustaining economy which is being able to look after 1.4 billion people.
Yeah. I think very interestingly, this government in the last 10 years has also enhanced its focus on many regions which were earlier considered non important
Yes.
or may have even been ignored. I haven't even begun speaking about the FIPIC,
Hmm.
the Forum for India and Pacific Islands.
The
that is
Raisina
being-
Hills talks
Yeah.
that happens like every year.
Yeah. So coming back to the FIPIC countries, if you can call it that, India has been enhancing its cooperation, not just with small island nations over here, but with small island nations all the way in the Pacific, like
Fiji.
countries like Papua New Guinea,
Fiji has a very
uh,
big, very big Indian origin
yeah,
population.
I believe Hindi is still one of the languages
Yes.
spoken over there. So I think this is a overall interesting take. This government's foreign policy will definitely be looked at as a pivot in history. I am not going very far and saying that it's the most successful we have ever been, but I do think that India is making more noise lately.
Understood.
I think that would be my concluding view,
Mm.
and
Yeah,
I
man. I
think we
think
can
we
we
can
can
just
conclude our
conclude
conversation
our
also on
conversation.
that.
Thank you for
Thank you for joining
joining
us.
us,
Please
and
like, share,
please
subscribe.
like, share, subscribe.